The dinner party at the sprawling downtown penthouse was a masterclass in elegance, the crystal glasses clinking in rhythm with the polite laughter of Chicago's elite. But beneath the heavy mahogany table, Sarah's hand didn't rest on her husband's knee. It lingered intimately on the thigh of the man sitting directly across from them, her firm's wealthiest client. It was a silence loud enough to shatter 7 years of marriage, a secret screaming to be heard in a room full of people pretending not to notice. If you find yourself drawn to the quiet, devastating moments where love fractures and secrets unravel behind closed doors, stay with me, because this story is just beginning. The rain in Chicago didn't wash things clean. It just made the grime slicker, reflecting the neon distortion of the city lights. Inside the penthouse on the 42nd floor, the silence was heavier than the storm battering the floor-to-ceiling windows. Ethan stood by the kitchen island, his hand resting on the cold marble countertop. He was looking at his wife, Sarah, but she was looking at her reflection in the darkened glass of the window, adjusting an earring that cost more than Ethan had made in the last 3 months. "You're not going to say anything?" Ethan asked. His voice was steady, though his chest felt like it had been hollowed out with a rusty spoon. Sarah turned, her expression devoid of the warmth he had fallen in love with 7 years ago. In its place was a sleek, manicured indifference. She picked up her phone, her thumb hovering over a message thread that Ethan wasn't supposed to know about. But he knew. He had known since he saw the way Julian Vance looked at her during the gala last week, like he owned her, and like she wanted to be owned. "There's nothing to obey, Ethan," Sarah replied, her tone clipping the air like shears. "We're delaying the inevitable. You're unhappy because you feel inadequate. I'm unhappy because I'm bored." "Bored," Ethan repeated, the word tasting like ash. "We built this life together, Sarah. You call that boredom?" "I built this life," she corrected him, her eyes flashing with a sudden cold sharpness. She gestured around the immaculate, sterile apartment. "My salary pays the mortgage. My connections got us into this building. You're still drawing sketches for buildings that never get built. You're a dreamer, Ethan, and dreamers are expensive pets to keep." The insult landed with precision. Ethan looked down at his hands that created, drafted, and designed, now trembling slightly. "So that's what this is? I'm a pet you're tired of feeding? Is that what Julian tells you?" Sarah didn't flinch at the name. She didn't even blink. She walked over to the counter, pouring herself a glass of water, taking a sip before setting it down with a deliberate clink. "Julian is a winner, Ethan. He understands the world as it is, not how he wishes it to be. He looks at me and sees a partner in a kingdom. You look at me and see a savior." She leaned in, her perfume, a scent he used to adore, now smelling cloying and suffocating. "I'm done saving you. I want a man, not a project." Ethan felt a strange calm settle over him, the kind of clarity that comes right before a car crash. "You're throwing this away. Everything we were." "I'm taking out the trash, Ethan," she said softly, the cruelty of the statement wrapped in a terrifyingly casual delivery. "I need you gone. Tonight. Julian is coming over in the morning to help me redecorate the study, and I don't want your clutter there." "Tonight?" Ethan looked at the rain lashing against the glass. "It's a storm out there, Sarah." "Then you better start packing quickly," she said, turning her back to him and walking toward the bedroom. "Leave the keys on the counter. And Ethan, don't make a scene in the lobby. It reflects poorly on me." Ethan stood alone in the kitchen's sterile light. He looked at the woman he had vowed to protect, realizing she had become the danger he needed protection from. He didn't scream. He didn't beg. He didn't throw the glass vase sitting on the table. He walked to the closet, pulled out a single duffel bag, and began to pack. He took only what he had bought with his own money, his sketchbook, his laptop, a few changes of clothes, and his grandfather's watch. He left the wedding band on the marble island, right next to the keys. As he opened the heavy front door, the sound of the television drifted from the bedroom. She was already watching a show, already moving on. Ethan stepped out into the hallway, the door clicking shut behind him with a finality that echoed in his bones. He walked toward the elevator, the humiliation burning his skin, but beneath it, a tiny, hard seed of resolve began to take root. She called him trash. He would spend the rest of his life proving she was the one who couldn't tell the difference between glass and diamond. The elevator ride down to the lobby took 40 seconds. In that time, Ethan went from being a husband in a multi-million-dollar penthouse to a man with a duffel bag and nowhere to go. When the door slid open, the night concierge, a man Ethan had greeted every evening for 3 years, looked up with a polite smile that faltered when he saw the bag and the look in Ethan's eyes. Ethan didn't stop to explain. He couldn't bear the pity of a stranger. He pushed through the revolving doors and the wind hit him like a physical blow. The Chicago winter was unforgiving, the rain mixing with sleet, stinging his face. He hailed a taxi, his arm feeling heavy, as if the lead of the city sky had seeped into his bones. "Where to?" the driver asked, eyeing Ethan's soaked coat through the rearview mirror. "Just drive west," Ethan said, his voice raspy. "I'll tell you when to stop." He couldn't go to the Ritz. He couldn't go to their usual haunts. Sarah's credit cards were likely already canceled, or would be by morning, and he refused to see a declined message on a screen tonight. He had his own savings, but they were modest. An architect's salary that had been siphoned off for years to pay for shared expenses that were mostly hers. 20 minutes later, the cab pulled up to a roadside motel with a flickering neon sign that buzzed with an irritating, rhythmic hum. It was the kind of place people went when they wanted to disappear, or when they had already been forgotten. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and lemon pledge. Ethan dropped his bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the mattress. The springs groaned under his weight. He looked around, peeling beige wallpaper, a small television bolted to the dresser, and a window that looked out onto a brick wall. An hour ago, his view had been the glittering skyline of the Gold Coast. Now it was wet bricks and darkness. He shivered, the dampness of his clothes finally registering. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen lit up the dim room. No missed calls, no messages. Part of him, the pathetic part that still loved the memory of who Sarah used to be, had hoped she might regret it, that she might text him to come back, that it was just a fight, just the stress. But the screen remained blank. The silence was absolute. He opened his contacts and scrolled to Sarah. Her picture was there, a candid shot he had taken of her in Napa Valley 4 years ago, back when her smile reached her eyes, before the ambition consumed her, before Julian. His thumb hovered over the call button. If he called, he could probably talk his way back onto the couch for a night. He could apologize for things he didn't do, promise to be more ambitious, promise to be whatever accessories she wanted. "I'm taking out the trash, Ethan." The words echoed in the cramped room, bouncing off the thin walls. He wasn't trash. He was a man who had built structures that withstood storms stronger than this one. Ethan's jaw tightened. A cold, hard anger replaced the sorrow in his chest. He didn't dial. Instead, he opened the settings menu. He selected block caller. Then he went to her social media profiles, the curated feed of their perfect life, and blocked those too. Finally, he deleted her number from his phone entirely. He tossed the phone onto the other pillow, the empty one. Ethan stripped off his wet shirt and walked into the bathroom. The mirror was cracked in the corner. He looked at his reflection. Pale, exhausted, eyes rimmed with red, but standing. He turned on the faucet, splashing cold water on his face. "Okay," he whispered to the empty room. "Okay." He was starting from zero. No home, no wife, no status. But for the first time in years, the air he breathed, stale and smoky as it was, belonged entirely to him. The closet in Julian's penthouse was larger than the first apartment Sarah and Ethan had rented together. It was a cavern of cedar and glass, lit by motion sensor track lights that made her clothes look like merchandise in a high-end boutique. Sarah ran her hand over the row of evening gowns Julian had purchased for her in the last 2 weeks. They were exquisite, silk, velvet, chiffon, but they were all in shades he preferred. Deep navy, charcoal, black. The vibrant reds and emerald greens she used to love were slowly migrating to the back of the rack. "Wear the silver one, Biao," Julian called out from the bedroom. He didn't ask, he instructed. Sarah hesitated, her fingers lingering on a crimson dress. "I was thinking the red. It feels more me." Julian appeared in the doorway, adjusting his cufflinks. He looked like a magazine cover, impeccably groomed, exuding the kind of casual power that made waiters nervous. He walked over, took the red dress from her hand, and slid it back onto the rack. "The silver matches my tie," he said, dropping a kiss on her bare shoulder. It was possessive, not affectionate, and it looks better with the lighting at the club. "We're meeting the investors from Tokyo tonight. Subtlety is key." Sarah swallowed the retort rising in her throat. She put on the silver dress. The dinner was at a private members club in the West Loop, a place where the menu had no prices and the walls were lined with abstract art that cost millions. Sarah sat next to Julian, her back straight, her smile practiced. "The PR landscape is shifting," Sarah said during a lull in the conversation, eager to contribute. She turned to the investor across from her. "With the new algorithm updates, crisis management is becoming less about suppression and more about narrative redirection. Just last week, I had a client who—" "Sarah handles the fluff pieces," Julian interrupted smoothly, placing a hand on her forearm. His grip was firm, a silent command to stop. He laughed, a low, rich sound that charmed the table but froze Sarah's blood. "She makes the messy look pretty, but let's talk about the hard assets, shall we?" The table chuckled. The spotlight shifted back to Julian. Sarah sat frozen. Under the table, her hands clenched in her lap. With Ethan, dinner conversations had been a tennis match of ideas. He would listen to her dissect a campaign for hours, offering insights, asking questions, respecting her intellect. He had been her sounding board. Julian just wanted a billboard. She took a sip of her wine, a vintage that cost more than Ethan's monthly rent. It tasted metallic. Later that night, back in the penthouse, Sarah stood by the panoramic window while Julian took a shower. The city sprawled out below them, a grid of amber and white. From this height, the people were invisible. The noise was gone. It was quiet, peaceful, and utterly lonely. She checked her phone. No messages. Her friends, the ones who had known Ethan, had been distant. They posted photos of casual brunches and messy game nights, things she was no longer invited to. She was now in the VIP section, separated by a velvet rope that kept everyone else out, but also kept her trapped in. Julian walked out of the bathroom, a towel around his waist. He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against him. "You were perfect tonight," he whispered into her ear. "Everyone couldn't take their eyes off you. You fit right in. You fit right in. Not you were smart, not you were funny, just that she fit the aesthetic." "I'm tired, Julian," she said, leaning her head back, trying to convince herself that this was the life she wanted. This was the upgrade. "Go to sleep then," he said, releasing her and walking toward his home office. "I have calls to make. Hong Kong markets are opening." Sarah climbed into the massive bed alone. The sheets were Egyptian cotton, cool and smooth against her skin. She closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come. In the silence of the million-dollar room, she realized she hadn't spoken a single real sentence all night. She was just another beautiful thing in Julian Vance's collection, placed exactly where he wanted her. 2 years had passed since the night of the storm, and Ethan's life had shrunk in size but expanded in density. He no longer lived in the sky, looking down on the city. He lived in it. His studio apartment in Pilsen was a converted warehouse space, exposed brick, piping that rattled when the heat kicked on, and large, drafty windows that looked out onto a train overpass. It was a far cry from the Gold Coast penthouse, but it smelled of cedar shavings, strong coffee, and graphite. It smelled like work. It was 2 a.m. Ethan sat at his drafting table, illuminated by the harsh glow of an architect's lamp. He wasn't staring at a computer screen. He was cutting balsa wood with an X-Acto knife, his movements precise and rhythmic. He was building a scale model for the Green Line project, affordable, sustainable housing designed to integrate vertical gardens into low-income urban areas. It was the kind of project his old firm would have laughed at. "Where is the ROI?" they would ask. "Where is the prestige?" Sarah would have hated it. She would have called it cute in that patronizing tone she reserved for things that didn't generate six figures. Ethan glued a miniature balcony into place, holding it steady with his thumb. For the first year after the separation, the silence of this apartment had been deafening. He had drowned it out with podcasts, music, anything to stop the loop of Sarah's insults playing in his head. Dead weight, trash, dreamer. But tonight the silence wasn't empty. It was full. It was the heavy, pregnant silence of creation. His phone buzzed on the workbench, vibrating against a stray ruler. Ethan glanced at it. It was an email notification from the Chicago Urban Design Grant Committee. He wiped the glue from his fingers and picked up the phone. His heart hammered against his ribs, a physical reaction he hadn't felt in a long time. Not since the day he walked out of the marriage. He tapped the screen. Dear Mr. Wright, we are pleased to inform you that your proposal for the Green Line project has advanced to the final round of funding. Ethan let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He wasn't rich. He was actually barely scraping by, eating instant noodles more often than he'd like to admit. But he was building something real. He stood up and walked to the window. A train rumbled past, the graffiti on its side a blur of color in the night. He took a sip of cold coffee from a chipped mug. In his old life, a win meant securing a contract for a glass skyscraper that looked exactly like every other glass skyscraper. It was a win for the firm, a win for the partners, a win for Sarah's social standing. It never felt like a win for him. This small email, this wooden model sitting on a scarred table, felt like a victory. He looked around the room. There were no designer sofas, no art pieces bought for investment value. There was just his bed, his books, and his work. He realized with a sudden, sharp clarity that he was happy, not the manic, high-stakes happiness of a successful dinner party, but a quiet, sturdy contentment. He thought of Sarah then, not with anger, but with a distant curiosity. He wondered if she was sleeping in the penthouse, surrounded by things she owned but didn't create. He wondered if she ever stood by the window and felt the city breathing, or if she only saw her own reflection in the glass. Ethan turned back to the table. He had work to do. The grant presentation was in 2 weeks and the roof design needed to be perfect. He picked up the X-Acto knife again. The blade caught the light, sharp and clean. He was rebuilding his life from the ground up, and this time, the foundation was his own. The crisis started at 4:00 p.m. on a Friday. A pharmaceutical client CEO had been caught on a hot mic making derogatory comments about patients. By 6:00 Twitter was in flames. By 8:00 p.m., Sarah's phone had vibrated so many times her hand felt numb. She sat in the back of an Uber, the city lights blurring past in streaks of aggressive red and white. She was exhausted. Her throat was raw from talking down reporters and panic-stricken board members. All she wanted was to walk through the door, kick off her heels, and have someone pour her a drink and say, "Tell me everything, welcome on, and we'll figure it out." That was what Ethan used to do. He would listen for hours, dissecting the problem with her, offering calm, structural solutions to her chaotic fires. Sarah keyed into the penthouse. The air inside was conditioned to a perfect, chilly 68 degrees. Julian was on the leather sofa, an iPad propped on his knees, a glass of scotch untouched on the coaster. "I'm going to kill someone," Sarah announced, dropping her purse on the floor, a habit Julian hated. "The Sterling account is imploding. They want me to issue a statement by midnight, but legal is blocking every draft." She walked over to the minibar, her hands shaking slightly as she reached for the vodka. Julian didn't look up from his screen. "Sterling? The mid-cap pharma guys? I told you 6 months ago their leadership was unstable. You should have dropped them." Sarah paused, the bottle hovering over the glass. "I can't just drop a client because you think they're unstable, Julian. This is my career. I'm trying to save a reputation here." "It's PR, Sarah," Julian said, finally glancing up. His eyes were flat, bored. "It's damage control for people who got caught. Don't act like you're performing open-heart surgery. Just release the standard apology template and come sit down. You're vibrating." The dismissal hit her harder than the stress. Just PR. To him, her stress was a nuisance, a buzzing fly in his quiet palace. "I don't need a strategy lecture," Sarah said, her voice tight. I needed you to listen." "I am listening," Julian said, turning back to his iPad. "I'm just telling you it's not worth the blood pressure. If they fire you, who cares? I make more in a week than that firm pays you in a year." Sarah set the glass down. She didn't drink it. The money. It always came back to the money. He thought he was comforting her by reminding her of his wealth, but he was actually telling her that her struggles were irrelevant. She turned and walked into the library, the one room in the house she felt vaguely comfortable in. She needed to distract herself. She pulled a heavy art book from the bottom shelf, The History of Chicago Architecture, intending to look at pictures of buildings that didn't talk back. As she opened the book, a piece of paper fluttered out and landed on the Persian rug. Sarah bent down to pick it up. It was a napkin, a cheap white cocktail napkin from a dive bar they used to go to in Wicker Park years ago. On it was a sketch done in black ink. It was a drawing of her. She was sleeping, her hair messy across the pillow. Underneath, in Ethan's neat, architectural block lettering, it read, "The only structure I never want to change." Her breath hitched. She remembered this night. They were celebrating her first promotion. She had fallen asleep at the table, exhausted and happy, and he had drawn her while she slept. He saw her mess, her fatigue, her imperfections, and he called it art. Julian saw her perfection, her fit, and called it adequate. Sarah sat on the floor, the heavy book forgotten. She traced the ink lines with her thumb. The paper was yellowing, fragile. A tear slid down her cheek, hot and fast. She wiped it away furiously, terrified that Julian might walk in and see her crying over a napkin. But she didn't need to worry. In the other room, the television volume went up. Julian wasn't coming to check on her. He assumed she was fine because he had told her to be fine. For the first time in 2 years, Sarah realized she wasn't just lonely. She was starving. The wind on the south side of Chicago cut harder than it did downtown, but Ethan didn't feel the cold. He stood on the third-floor scaffolding of the Green Line complex, watching the sunset reflect off the solar glass panels he had fought the city council for 6 months to approve. "Mr. Wright?" Ethan turned. A photographer from Dwell magazine was adjusting his lens, balancing precariously on a pile of drywall. Next to him was a journalist, a young woman with a recorder and a look of genuine admiration that Ethan was still getting used to. "Just Ethan is fine," he said, wiping drywall dust from his jeans. "Ethan," the journalist corrected herself, "the article is going to focus on the concept of regenerative architecture. You mentioned earlier that this building was born out of a personal collapse. Can you elaborate?" Ethan looked out over the neighborhood. It was rough, scarred, but resilient, just like him. "Sometimes," Ethan said slowly, choosing his words with the precision of a mason laying brick, "you have to tear a structure down to the studs to realize the foundation was never the problem. The problem was the decoration. Once I stripped away the noise, I could finally build something that lasts." He wasn't talking about the building. The journalist scribbled furiously. 3 days later, in the Gold Coast penthouse, the Sunday morning sun hit the coffee table with a blinding glare. Sarah sat with her legs tucked under her, nursing a lukewarm espresso. Julian was on a conference call in his study, the muffled sound of his voice, commanding, impatient, drifting down the hallway. Sarah picked up the stack of mail Julian's assistant had left. Bills, invitations to fundraisers, and the new issue of Dwell. Julian liked to keep them around to look cultured, though she doubted he ever read past the table of contents. She flipped through it idly, looking for design ideas for the guest room she was allowed to redecorate. Page 42. Her hand froze. The coffee cup rattled against the saucer as she set it down. It was a double-page spread. The headline was bold, Black Sans Serif, the architect of resilience. And there was Ethan. He looked different, older. The boyish softness she had associated with lack of ambition had hardened into a rugged, quiet confidence. He was wearing a flannel shirt and a hard hat, holding a set of blueprints, looking away from the camera with a half smile that didn't seek approval. He looked solid. Sarah's eyes frantically scanned the text. "Ethan Wright's vision has transformed a derelict block into a model of sustainable living. I spent years trying to design for luxury," Wright says, "but I realized that luxury is often just a mask. True architecture is about honesty." Honesty. The word pricked her skin. She looked at the sidebar. Net worth projected to triple, international acclaim, shortlisted for the Pritzker Emerging Artist Award. "What are you reading?" Sarah jumped. Julian was standing over her, holding his own empty mug. He glanced down at the magazine. "Oh, that," Julian scoffed, a dismissive smirk playing on his lips. "I heard about that. Cute little project in the ghetto. Someone's feeling charitable." "It's not charitable," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "It's brilliant. He won the urban design grant." Julian shrugged, taking the magazine from her hand and tossing it onto the side table, covering Ethan's face with a coaster. "It's low-margin work, Sarah. He's playing in the dirt while we didn't own the sky. Don't let nostalgia cloud your judgment. The man is still a carpenter in a world of kings." Julian walked toward the kitchen, expecting her to follow, expecting her to agree. Sarah stared at the magazine under the coaster. She looked at the apartment around her, the cold marble, the expensive art, the silence. Julian called this owning the sky. But looking at the life in Ethan's eyes in that photo, Sarah had the sinking, nauseating realization that she was the one who was buried. She reached out and slowly, carefully, moved the coaster off Ethan's face. The Chicago Cultural Center was a cathedral of light and sound. Under the massive Tiffany stained glass dome, the city's elite mingled with international artists, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of deals being struck. 5 years ago, Sarah would have walked into this room with her head high, gripping Ethan's arm to guide him, to tell him who to talk to and who to avoid. Tonight, she walked in a step behind Julian, her hand resting lightly on the crook of his elbow, her body draped in a charcoal silk gown that she hadn't chosen. "Smile," Julian murmured, not looking at her. He was scanning the room for potential investors. "You look like you're at a funeral." "I'm just overwhelmed," Sarah lied. She wasn't overwhelmed, she was terrified. The room was buzzing with one name. It wasn't the mayor's, and it wasn't Julian's. It was Wright. "There he is," Julian said, his voice dripping with a mix of amusement and disdain. "The man of the hour. Let's go pay our respects to the carpenter." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked toward the center of the room. A crowd had formed, a tight circle of black tuxedos and designer dresses, orbiting a single figure. Ethan stood in the center. He was wearing a midnight blue tuxedo that fit him perfectly, tailored, sharp, commanding. But it wasn't the clothes that stopped Sarah's breath. It was the way he stood. He wasn't slouching, he wasn't looking at his shoes. He was laughing, a genuine, easy sound, as he spoke to the city planning commissioner. He looked like a man who had not only survived the storm but had learned to command the weather. Julian pulled her forward. Sarah wanted to resist, to turn and run back to the safety of the shadows, but Julian's grip was iron. They breached the circle. "Ethan," Julian's voice boomed, cutting through the polite conversation. "Or should I say, the architect of resilience?" The circle parted. Ethan stopped speaking. He turned slowly, his eyes finding Julian first, then sliding to Sarah. For 5 years, Sarah had imagined this moment. In her head, he was either angry, screaming at her for what she did, or he was still broken, looking at her with puppy dog eyes, begging for a second chance. She wasn't prepared for the reality. Ethan looked at her with nothing, absolute, terrifying neutrality. It was the look one gives to a stranger on a subway or a piece of furniture in a hotel lobby. "Hello, Julian," Ethan said, his voice calm, deep. He nodded slightly to Sarah. "Sarah." "Quite the turnout," Julian said, stepping closer, puffing his chest out. "I saw the designs. Very rustic, efficient. Good for the brand, I suppose. Helping the less fortunate always plays well in the press." The insult was wrapped in silk, but everyone in the circle heard the edge. The air grew tense. Ethan didn't blink. He took a sip of his sparkling water. "It's not about the press, Julian. It's about building things that last. You know, structures that don't collapse when the wind changes." A few people nearby chuckled. Julian's smile tightened. He didn't like being outwitted, especially not by the man he had replaced. "Well, Julian said, his hand tightening painfully on Sarah's arm. "We just wanted to say congratulations. It's good to see you finally made something of yourself. Sarah was always worried you'd stagnate." Julian looked down at her, expecting her to chime in, to play her part as the supportive trophy. Sarah looked at Ethan. She saw the lines around his eyes, lines of hard work, of wisdom. She looked at his hands. hands that had built a legacy while she had been busy curating an image. Sarah started, her voice failing. Ethan looked at her then, really looked at her for a fleeting second, and in his eyes, she saw the truth. He didn't hate her, he had outgrown her. She was a chapter in a book he had finished reading a long time ago. "Thank you for coming," Ethan said, already turning back to the commissioner, dismissing them without a wave. "Excuse me, I need to discuss the zoning permits for Phase 2. He turned his back. Julian scoffed, pulling Sarah away toward the bar. "Arrogant prick. He thinks a few awards make him one of us." Sarah stumbled slightly in her heels as she was dragged away. She looked back over her shoulder. Ethan was glowing under the lights, surrounded by people who listened to him, who respected him. She realized then, with a nausea that roiled in her gut, that she wasn't the prize anymore. She was just the ex-wife of a great man, currently holding the drink of a rich one. The air on the terrace was sharp, carrying the bite of Lake Michigan, but the noise of the gala was muffled here, reduced to a dull hum behind the heavy glass doors. Sarah stepped out, clutching her shawl around her shoulders. She had told Julian she was going to the powder room. It was the first lie she had told him tonight, but it felt like the most honest thing she had done in years. Ethan was there, leaning against the stone balustrade, looking out at the illuminated bean in Millennium Park. He held a glass of scotch, the amber liquid catching the city light. He didn't turn when he heard her heels clicking on the stone. "It's cold out here," Sarah said softly. Ethan turned. He didn't smile, but he didn't frown either. His face was a mask of polite recognition. "It clears the head. The air inside is a bit thin." Sarah moved closer, stopping just outside his personal space. Up close, she could see the gray at his temples. It suited him. It made him look distinguished, anchored. "You were amazing in there, Ethan," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I always knew you had it in you. I always told people you were brilliant." Ethan took a slow sip of his drink. "Did you? I seem to remember you calling me a dreamer. And not as a compliment." The memory stung, but Sarah pressed on. She needed him to understand. She needed him to see that she was still the woman he had married, just lost. "I was scared, Ethan. We were stagnant. I thought pushing you was the only way. I made mistakes. I know that now." She waited for him to argue, to yell, to demand an apology. That would have been something. Anger is a connection. Anger means there is still heat in the ashes. But Ethan just looked at her with a calm, devastating mildness. "You didn't push me, Sarah. You dropped me." He set his glass down on the ledge. "But you were right about one thing. I was stagnant. I was trying so hard to be the husband you wanted that I forgot to be the architect I was. So in a way, I should thank you." Sarah's heart leaped. Thank you. That sounded like an opening. She took a step closer, her hand reaching out to touch the sleeve of his tuxedo. "We were good once, Ethan," she whispered, the desperation leaking into her tone. "For the money, before Julian, we were us. Do you ever think about that night? About undoing it?" Ethan looked at her hand on his sleeve. He didn't pull away, but he didn't lean into it. He gently, firmly removed her hand and placed it back at her side. "I used to," Ethan said honestly. "For the first year, I thought about it every day. I thought if I worked hard enough, if I became successful enough, I could buy my way back into your respect." "You have it," Sarah said quickly. "You have my respect. You have everyone's respect." "I know," Ethan said, "but I realized something, Sarah. I didn't do this to get you back. I did it to get me back. And now that I'm here, I realize I don't fit in that old life anymore. I don't fit with you." The doors behind them opened. A burst of laughter and warm light spilled onto the terrace. A woman appeared, elegant, with kind eyes and a warm smile, holding 2 coats. "Ethan," she called out softly, "the taxi is waiting. You promised you wouldn't. Stay too late." Ethan's face transformed. The polite mask fell away, replaced by a genuine, soft warmth that Sarah hadn't seen in 5 years. "Coming, Claire," he said. He turned back to Sarah one last time. "Take care of yourself, Sarah. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for." He walked away from the ledge, took his coat from the woman, and placed a hand on the small of her back. They walked back inside without looking back. Sarah stood alone on the terrace, The wind whipped around her bare shoulders, biting through the silk. Through the glass doors, she could see Julian across the room, checking his watch, looking annoyed, scanning the crowd for someone more important to talk to. She looked down at her hand, the one that had touched Ethan's sleeve. She had held a diamond, complained that it was just a rock, and thrown it into the dark. Now, watching him walk away, she realized the cruelest truth of all. The diamond hadn't shattered. It was just shining for someone else. Sarah turned back to the view of the cold, indifferent city, and for the first time in her life, she understood the true cost of ambition.